Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for April 13th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. Hope you've had a great start to your day. So our texts for today are Leviticus 17, Psalm 20 and 21, then Proverbs 31, fairly famous text, and 1 Timothy 2, a pretty controversial text. So we'll jump right in with 1 Timothy. So keep in mind what First Timothy is all about. Again, this is one of the pastoral epistles, and Paul is writing to Timothy, his protege, who was a leader at the church of Ephesus. Ephesus, one of the leading cities of the Greco-Roman world. It was a coastal city, very wealthy city, very pagan city, and we read about Ephesus several times in the book of Acts. But it was a strong church there and had strong leadership, of course, in the First and Timothy. Paul is dealing with, as he does, some of the pastoral issues that Timothy was facing, and giving him some encouragements on how to handle those issues. And one of those issues is, of course, the conduct of prayer. And he says here in the first part of this chapter, in chapter 2, to make entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgivings on behalf of all men. That's, I think, all without distinction, right? You want to do it for all, regardless of socioeconomic status, or whether they're Jew or Greek or whoever, you pray for them. But especially, notice what he says to pray for kings and those who are in authority. And I think this is probably a good admonition for us today, because we, of course, have a government that oftentimes does not do things that we would agree with. And we have leaders who do things that we would not agree with. And yet we are instructed to pray for them. So that, and here's the purpose, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Keep in mind that I think that this would have been harder for that first century church than us today. We, are not dealing with the types of persecution that they were undergoing from these same governmental sources. And yet Paul here instructs them to still pray for those people who are in authority. As he is talking about this subject of prayer, he gives some instructions that are very controversial in today's world on prayer and the conduct of women within the church service. And some of this is cultural conditioned, but some of it Paul grounds in an order that comes from creation itself. And I think we need to guard against several extremes here. There are some who say this is completely culturally conditioned, and we need to anything Paul says here is just tied to what was going on back then and has no application to us today. And then there's others on the other extreme who would say, well, you need to just take this text and apply it in this woodenly literal fashion without any understanding of the first century context that Paul is writing to. I think there's a balance to be had here, that Paul is writing based to a specific situation, but he also has some specific principles here that I think have become part of who we are in Baptist life. For instance, this is a key text for Paul, for the one of the sections of the Baptist Faith and Message that governs church polity, talking about the office of senior pastor being specifically for that of men. This is not the only passage that deals with that, but this is one of them that if you look at that section of the Baptist Faith and Message, it would deal with that. But at the same time, we also need to understand that these statements that Paul makes on adorning, women adorning themselves is specifically in that Greco-Roman context where, for instance, your outward appearance reflects something about who you are inwardly, and you don't want to identify with pagan elements of society in the way you dress outwardly that would not identify you as a believer in Jesus Christ. And I think that type of principle is still even valid today, that there is a theology in the way we present ourselves, not just in the way we dress, but also in the way we present ourselves in our comportment and our behavior within church life and within our own personal lives, because we are representing Christ. Obviously, there's much more that we could talk about here. You can go back and listen to the Bible 101 I did on First Timothy a few months ago, if you want more details on this. And if you would like more details on some of the arguments, I can point you to some of the some good articles who would give you perhaps both opinions on some of the things that Paul's talking about here. Because again, you read scholarship on these issues and even popular Christian writings on this particular text, and you're going to have positions all over the place, and we need to respectfully engage those who disagree with us on some of these issues. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. We'll move on to Leviticus 17. Leviticus 17 begins what's known in the book of Leviticus as the Holiness Code. I'll spend more time talking about that later, particularly when we get to chapter 19, which is the heart of the Holiness Code. But the Holiness Code is, of course, there to tell the Israelites how are they to live in a way that will be holy before the Lord. And holiness in the Israelite context, if you want to look at Leviticus 20, verse 26, I believe it is, there's defined as holiness as separate from the cultures around them and dedicated to God. It's really kind of what Paul is talking about there in 1 Timothy 2, being separated from the world and dedicated to God. How do we show that? Well, Paul talks about, or in this case, Moses talks about how the Israelites would go about doing that. How do they, as a covenant community of faith, show themselves to be dedicated to God and separated out from the pagan cultures around them? In chapter 17, he's dealing with some of the issues of sacrifice still. He specifically talks at the end of the chapter on the issue of blood, and there's a significance to that. They talk about not eating the blood, for instance, and these types of things. And of course, the significance there is that the blood is tied to life in that ancient context. And it, of course, is tied intimately to the idea of sacrifice. And so blood had the specific role, a specific role in the community of faith, and that was to demonstrate atonement and demonstrate it was tied to sacrifice. It wasn't to be used for other purposes. It was this blood of the sacrifice was separated out and dedicated to God. Don't use it for common purposes. Don't use it for profane purposes, which is basically just common or unholy purposes, things that were everyday use. No, blood, because it is tied to life, because it is tied to sacrifice, had that specific purpose of being holy before the Lord in that way. So we'll talk about more of the idea of holiness as we go through the rest of the Holiness Code. That goes through chapter 26, by the way. And well, probably chapter 25. Chapter 26 deals more with the blessings and cursings, but we'll talk about that then. And then let's see, we got Psalm 20 and 21. Now, Psalm 20 and 21 are 20 especially is a royal psalm. Speaks of God's relationship to the king, asking God to act on behalf of the king. And if you turn over to that passage, I think it's interesting that you read Psalm 20 and 21 together, because I think these psalms actually probably are intended to go together. If not, some scholars even believe that they were part of a single psalm that was joined together that ultimately was separated out, because Psalm 20 seems to make that request for God to act on behalf of his king, and Psalm 21 expresses confidence that God has in fact done so. So these two are tied together. I think it is interesting, though, that the way in which the author, or the psalmist, talks about the anointed one of God. If you look at, where is it? I forget where this was in here. Where it refers to God's anointed, that idea of the Messiah of God, which of course is just a technical term of kingship, and yet it's ultimately fulfilled in the much greater way in the person of Jesus. But the way he talks about it, look at verse 7 of chapter 21 of Psalm 21, for instance. For the king trusts in the Lord, and through the loving kindness of the Most High, he will not be shaken. Obviously, the Israelites had kings who did not do this. Davidic kings who were anointed specifically of God for his purposes, who did not do this. And I think this creates within the Israelite reader, as they read about the king in this way, in the Psalms, and anticipation. Remember what the Psalms are. They are teaching us, they are instructing us how to think about things. And it's creating within the Israelite community this anticipation for one who would do this, who would trust perfectly in the king, who would rule righteously. Um, trust perfectly in God the king, who would rule righteously, who would show justice to the poor and the outcast. And yet they didn't have any kings who would do that perfectly, and that leads them to anticipate ultimately the person of the Messiah, the true Messiah, Jesus Christ. And that brings us to Proverbs 31. This is the famous, of course, proverb dealing with the virtuous wife. And it begins with some words of King Lemuel, who is mysterious. But then in verse 10, it begins what is an alphabetic acrostic. Going down to verse 31, there's 22 verses, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, each verse beginning with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And of course, by using all 22 verses, as with these acrostics, it demonstrates completeness and perfection. In this case, the completeness and perfection of the virtuous wife. And we talked, I think, at the very, very beginning of the book of Proverbs, how this functions within the totality of the book, that this is a book that begins with wisdom personified as a woman crying out in the streets. Wisdom is offered. Here it shows, after all those wisdom sayings throughout the rest of the book, it shows wisdom gained. And so, in a way, we read this often and say, well, this is a great model for, mothers and wives to pattern their lives after, talking about charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but the woman who fears the Lord, which is really what the author of Proverbs has been commending throughout the book, right? She shall be praised. Really, I think you could say that Proverbs 31 is not just for women, it's for everybody in that way, because we want to have this wisdom gained. And what does wisdom gain look like? It's when you have, for instance, somebody who fears the Lord, somebody who works diligently, someone who, verse 20, extends the hand to the poor and the outcast and the needy, someone who is providing for their family. These are things that everyone should aspire to. And it's an aspiration that's realized ultimately when you seek after wisdom and you gain it through the gift of the Lord, right? And through fearing the Lord. And so, it's obviously a text that we often apply to the ladies in our life, but really I think it has a much broader application. In fact, I've always joked that I would love to preach this text on a Father's Day. And maybe I'll do that sometime and preach Proverbs 31 and apply it specifically to men, because frankly, it applies to all of us on this day, April 13th, 2021. I hope you have a great rest of the day.